So now please let me introduce our presenter. Cary Sneider is a lead writer for the NGSS as well as a research professor at Portland State University. Cary, we're all yours.
Well, thank you, Ella, and I'm delighted to be here today. I set up the webcam so you could see the background, at least part of it. This is the city of Chicago. Now, I live in Portland, Oregon, but I'm here in Chicago at the headquarters of YMCA. And just a little word about that. The YMCA is very interested in developing STEM programs for their after-school and summer camps and so forth, as has done the 4-H and Girls Incorporated and Girl Scouts and a number of other groups. So this really represents a major sea change in education in the country, thinking about both school and outside of school time as a way of increasing the hours that students have to learn STEM. And the next generation science standards really has the potential to provide a common ground, a common language for both of those. So I do hope that some of you out there may be informal educators or know some and would be interested in having a talk with them and communicating how you could do complementary work. So today's webinar is about an area that I find especially interesting. It's also probably one of the most challenging, and that's the idea of linking the core ideas, what we used to call the contents, and the practices, or what we used to call the science processes, or inquiry skills. And there's some specific reasons for linking those two, which I'll be describing during the webinar. I also noticed a broad spread. There was about a third of you that have primary work in the 912 area. So I will be making this relevant, of course, to all K-12 areas, but we've selected examples from K-5 when we get to the performance expectations a little later. But the essential ideas will apply across K-12. So let's get started. I'm going to ask Alla to advance the slides today so that we don't have a glitch that we had last time. So Alla, let's get started. So first of all, why bother linking core ideas and practices? In the past, if you open up, for example, the National Science Education Standards or the benchmarks for science literacy, what you'll find is a series of statements, of information statements. And you'll find a separate section all about the practices or the core or the science processes. The next generation science standards, they're called scientific or inquiry processes, and they're in a separate section. A little like textbooks have been in the past, where you have a section about the scientific method in the beginning and then the core ideas later. So it simply hasn't worked well, and it hasn't worked well for a number of reasons. Let's advance to the next bullet, Alla. So the idea of linking core ideas and practices means that students need to learn to use the ideas that they're learning. They need to learn to use their knowledge. So it's not enough today to say that kids know this, that they can answer a question about it on a test. The idea here behind the next generation standards and the framework before that is that they learn really useful knowledge so they can use their science to solve problems and meet people's actual needs. Next slide. So the way this works out in the next generation science standards is in the form of something called a performance expectation. And the idea is that the performance expectations clearly link the practice with the core idea. So each one begins with a verb, and the verb represents practice, what students should do, and the core idea is what they should do with that information. So let's go on. Slide. So the next couple of slides really emphasize my background and why I've been such a champion of linking the core ideas and practices together in next generation science standards. And I will tell you, I was involved in the writing committee, but I didn't just do this because I was asked to do it or told to do it. I did it because I really believe in it. And so here's a short story. I was a facilitator of the last standards revision in the state of Washington a few years ago, and had a team of 30 or 40 teachers and science coordinators and so forth. And we worked at it for several months, and then we went out to different places in the state to roll it out, to get feedback on the drafts and so forth. And one of the teachers, I remember, commented that they were too vague. And he said, look, just tell me what my students are supposed to know and be able to do, and they can learn it. But vague standards about what the kids are supposed to, quote, know, make it a high-stakes guessing game. So he was, now, keep in mind that until then, a lot of educators have said, you know, I do what I do. I'm good at what I do. Make the statements sufficiently vague so I can keep doing what I'm doing, teaching. But the idea of tests have become so important and so high stakes that we really, in order for our kids to succeed, we really need to be really clear about what those tests are testing. Now, the next generation science standards are assessment standards. They don't explain what students should learn or how they should learn it, but what they should know after instruction. So what we're doing is meeting this particular teacher's need and others as well. Let's look at the next slide. Now, this is about a study by Cary and Sneider. These are the ones that published it. And it was a collaboration between university educators and teachers and science coordinators in New Jersey. And they conducted a year-long experiment. They said, look, if we really believe in standards, and our state has some standards, quite a few standards, in fact, in science, let's do the very, very best we can, use the best curriculum we can find, and let's teach it to some of the neediest schools in our state, and let's see how we do. Well, they did, and they did their best. And they found that in some of the areas, the suburban schools in particular that tended to have the best facilities, the best trained teachers, the students did quite well and were able to meet the standards. In the inner city and schools where teaching was more challenging, they also found that they could reach the same level of mastery, but it took longer. A curriculum that took 2 days in the suburbs took 2 weeks in the inner city. So the point was that, yes, we can teach to mastery, but only a certain amount of it, and our standards are really overstuffed. That's the state standard. So part of the reason for developing the next generation science standards is to limit the total number of ideas that students are expected to learn and to be really clear. So this is a quote from the article that described this effort and the difficulty they had. In order to ward off excessive width or depth in teaching, a teacher needs to know specifically what content should be taught, at what grade level, and to what level of mastery, and measured by what set of performance objectives. So I shared this article, in fact, with everybody else on the writing team well before we started. I'm not pretending that I was the one to set the tone, because everybody was really on that same page when I got there. So this is why we have performance expectations. Now, the rest of this presentation is to tell you about them, but I really wanted to set the stage on why they're important. So let's move on. Slide, please. Okay. So if you remember, those of you who were with me in a prior webinar, we spent the whole webinar actually talking about the core ideas. And these were 12 ideas from the framework, the most important ideas. And in the second webinar, it was about how each of these progresses over time from kindergarten through grade 12. So these are really the big ideas that we want students to leave at the 12th grade with. But we also have exit ideas at each grade level up through grade 5, and then a grade band from grades 6, 8, and 9, 12. So the idea of this webinar is to show how these core ideas relate to the practices. So we're going to spend some time taking a good look at those practices so it's clear what they are. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, we're going to begin with the first practice. And an idea that you'll be seeing throughout this next set of 8 slides is that each practice can be viewed from a science lens or from an engineering lens. So specifically, they're called practices for science and engineering. So, for example, practice 1 is about asking questions and defining problems. So from a science point of view, the question is about some phenomena. Now, it's not only a phenomenon in the natural world, it can be a phenomena in the designed world also, but it's a question. So, for example, let's suppose there's a unit about plant growth, and a student who is involved in the hydroponics unit might say, well, how come it grows without soil? That's a science question. An engineering question is, how do I water it at night? So let's suppose these plants, of course, I just realized that hydroponics means they're in water all the time. So let's change that to how do they get their nutrients at night. So there might need to be a mechanism where they're automatically fed certain nutrients at different times of day. That's an engineering question. How do I accomplish something? How do I meet a particular need? Science is, how do I satisfy my curiosity? So that's the first question, and or the first practice. And one way to think about this practice is that in science classes, so often students are given an experiment to do. The question's already there. It's very rare that students actually have an opportunity to ask questions, because, frankly, it's hard to then, once they ask it, to lead them to through a course of activities where they get to answer it. But in the next generation science standards, there's a much more of an emphasis on getting kids to really ask questions and to be clear about their questions, and then to reformulate their question in a way that actually it can be answered through some investigation that they might do. In engineering, every design challenge might begin with kind of a fuzzy problem statement, but the students, in order to solve it, to solve that problem, need to define it much more precisely. So in engineering, the idea of defining a problem to solve, which is the correlate to an asking a question in science, is also very important. So the idea is that we're going to emphasize this asking questions and defining problems much more than we have before. So let's move on to the next practice. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about practices now. I mentioned core ideas. Later in this webinar, we're going to put the two together. But I want to be sure we go through the 8 practices, so when we start putting them together, you're really clear about what these practices are. So developing and using models. From a science perspective, student might make some models to look at the difference between a shield volcano and a stratus volcano. So a shield volcano is a kind in Hawaii. They're eruptions of lava, and the lava spreads out, and it makes a shape sort of like this, like a shield. Whereas inland, where I live, in Portland, Oregon, where we've had Mount St. Helens, there's the Pacific plate that's been subducting under the North Atlantic plate. And when it reaches a certain depth, a couple hundred miles inland, it's heated to the extent that it releases its water and releases its gases, and they explode. And you get this vast quantities of ash into the air, forming a volcano like this. Two very different types of volcanoes. So students might be making models of some sort. Perhaps even a kind of model that actually would, one would produce a liquid that would form this shape, whereas another would use some sort of ejection material that would form the stratus shape. There are all sorts of models. You can make a model of an ecosystem. You can make a computer model. You can make a mathematical model, not just a physical model. But the idea is you create a model to either communicate an idea or, better yet, to test your vision of what's actually happening in the real world. Now, engineers also develop models, and they use models. And in that case, they develop a model usually to test the solution to a problem. So an example here is to see how a biplane might function differently from a monoplane. So you would make the two the same fuselage and so forth, but a biplane do that, another wing, something of that sort. Again, the goal in the case of an engineer is to solve a problem. The goal in the case of science is to answer a question. So, but they're both developing models. And there are other things about models that we want kids to learn. So, for example, models are representations of the real world, but they are not the real world. So they simplify. They're simplifying assumptions. So you have to test your models. They don't always, they don't represent the full world. So models are always limited, yet they allow you to isolate certain parts of what you're studying to simplify them and to understand them better. But again, engineers, scientists use them differently. Let's go on to the next slide. The third practice is planning and carrying out investigations. Now, most of science education has actually been in this particular practice. In the next generation science standards, it's just one of 8 practices, but it's an important one nonetheless. So in science, you do an investigation to answer a question. Now, some investigations are simply confirmatory. You have a hypothesis based on a theory that you were just taught, and you're going to do an investigation to try that out. But in other cases, it's really valuable when kids do experiments to a question that the teacher doesn't have an answer to. So one of them that my students actually did were a series of experiments to find out what the different ingredients in a simple sugar cookie recipe actually did. So the baking soda, what if we double the sugar or have the sugar or have no eggs? How do they come out? So again, that's a question. But if you're trying to do the same similar sort of thing, but you're trying to accomplish a goal like to make softer cookies. So you have a recipe for crispy cookies, and you love the flavor, but you want them to be softer. What would you change to make them softer? Well, you could do some experiments to find out. So sometimes what students are doing, you can't tell if it's science or engineering unless you talk to the kids. And you say, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And if they express a goal, they're doing engineering. If they're trying to answer a question, they're doing science. Let's move on. Practice 4 is about interpreting and analyzing data. And again, you can do from a science point of view. So for example, let's say we're moving on to the same investigation. And doing the science experiment, a student who did the experiment might say, if I ask 10 students to taste each batch of cookies, I can find out the effects of the baking soda. So that's gathering data. The engineering student might say, if I measure how long the cookies last, I can find out if my recipe worked. Well, again, there's kind of a gray zone here about which is which. But look at what the second student said. He wanted to create soft cookies because he believed not only he likes them soft, but he thinks other people do too. So his real goal was to make cookies that everybody's going to love. And you know, if you're a cookie manufacturer, that's just the kind of goal you want, and you want to hire an engineer, a food engineer, to help you figure out how to do that. So, so it involves some science too, because that engineer really wants to know a lot about food and already have a lot of knowledge about food. But putting that knowledge to work, that's engineering. Let's move on to practice 5. Okay, using mathematics and computational thinking. So here's another example. The scientist might say, or a science student might say, how are lionfish disrupting the ecosystem? Now, lionfish are a very well-known invasive species. Invasive species is a major problem planet-wide. And studying invasive species from a viewpoint of science is you're trying to understand how this invasive species functions in the ecosystem. The idea of science versus engineering isn't a matter of people. So it's not like you have to have a scientist and engineer in order to solve a problem. No, actually what often happens is a person will put on one hat than another at a different time. So typically a person, an environmentalist or environmental scientist or engineer, needs to figure out what's going on first, and then asks a different kind of question. will introducing a lionfish predator help this ecosystem recover? I could do a simulation to find out. So there you're actually implementing an intervention to try to accomplish a goal. In this case, you're simulating it before you actually do it, which is a really wise idea when you're trying to change ecosystems. So one of the interesting things that developed during the writing of the Next Generation Science Standards is that we agreed we would stop talking about scientists and engineers, and we would start talking about doing science and doing engineering. Because in the professional realm, you have people that flop back and forth. Some of them call themselves scientists, some of them call themselves engineers. But the important thing is that they're really a distinct set of goals or a distinct set of skills, and we want our students to have those skills. We want our students to be able to inquire about the natural world, but we also want students to be able to put their knowledge and their skills to work and solve problems. So, so let's move on to the next one, practice number 6. So constructing explanations or designing solutions. Now, this is just like the first practice where there's a distinction between asking questions and defining problems. This is the other practice where there's a fundamental difference, because the end point of asking a question is explaining that phenomenon that you asked the question about. So in this case, a science explanation might be by investigating the contents of lionfish stomachs. We found out that they eat many different species of reef fish. So this is how a scientist might find out how and why lionfish in particular disrupt ecosystems. It's because they eat a lot of different kinds of fish. That's an explanation for that question. Whereas an engineer would solve the problem by saying, by introducing lionfish predator in a large tank, we found out that our simulation is accurate and biodiversity will eventually recover. So again, here you're proposing a solution to a problem. Notice that they, what they did, what I'm trying to explain here is that this group of engineers first tried a simulation, and it looked like bringing a predator into this ecosystem would solve the problem. But they didn't want to do it until they actually tried it out. So they went to an aquarium where there's a large tank, and they put lionfish into the tank, and they started eating the reef fish, and they added some predators, and they found out that, in fact, the predators will keep the lionfish under control, and that, in fact, that their biodiversity in that tank began to recover. Now, this is a simulation right now. This is I'm not reporting a scientific experiment, so be careful about what you do with your lionfish back home. The point is that engineers, or engineering rather, is the process of actually doing something with the knowledge that you've gained to solve a problem. And even then, they may decide not to do that because of the potential for unexpected side effects. And this is something else about engineering that is an important thing for kids to learn. It's one of those skills that you do your best to anticipate unanticipated side effects. And imagining if something did happen and the predators started eating something else you didn't want them to eat, how serious would it be compared with the lionfish invasion? So those are really deep questions, and they involve economic issues and social issues and sometimes even ethical issues. So when you start going down that path, you do stray from the standard science. And that's okay. According to the Next Generation Science Standards, it's time to start branching out and really thinking about how we're using our science to solve problems. So let's go on to practice number 7, which is engaging in argument from evidence. Now, this is another one where it's quite similar, that you want students to use evidence, and but again, in service of different tasks. So here's, imagine a science classroom. So a student might say, by investigating the contents of lionfish stomachs, we found out they eat many different kinds of reef fish. And another student would say, well, how many lionfish did you investigate? Are you really sure of that? If you only investigated one lionfish, maybe, that's not enough information, and we need to gather further evidence. So that's argument about the evidence to determine if we really can draw a good conclusion. So a different kind of argument would happen if you're having an engineering discussion. So, imagine the prior statement: by introducing lionfish predators into a large tank, we found out that our simulation was right, biodiversity will recover. And another student might say, well, what damage might the predators do to the other fish? So this is, again, the argument about, are we taking into account unanticipated side effects, and having that sort of discussion. So there are two different types of discussions, but they both involve evidence. So, and they involve, you know, asking yourself the question, do we have enough evidence? Now, one interesting thing about this, and this is why I'm a real advocate for engineering education, is there's a really good reason in this case for looking for further evidence. Yes, we'd like to know what would happen. We might want to know more about what lionfish eat, but what we really care about is everything else in the tank and those poor other fish that are being devoured by the lionfish, and really solving the problems of invasive species. So in my view, engineering brings a level of motivation that science doesn't always bring by itself. Let's go on to the last practice, practice number 8. And this is one where both scientists and engineers spend time reading and evaluating the works of their colleagues, and writing and speaking about their own findings. And one of the interesting articles, it's chapter 3 in the framework, is reliant on a lot of research about both scientists and engineers. And when we think of scientists and engineers, we imagine them in laboratories, doing investigations, figuring things out, taking things apart. Whereas a lot of the time that professionals spend is going to conferences and reading and writing, sitting at their computer all day and writing up their ideas. So as much as half their time, in fact. So these are skills that we want kids to do too. And keeping in mind that not all kids are going to become scientists or engineers, but they all need to communicate whatever the job is, wherever it is on the scale of high-earning jobs or low-earning jobs. The point is you have to be able to hear what people say, respectfully argue when it's necessary to do that about what the best course of action is, and then communicate your ideas. So these are skills that are equally important in the science classroom. So that's the set of 8 practices. And the one thing I'll say about this as a set, they replace what we used to call scientific inquiry. Now, frankly, I kind of liked the scientific inquiry section of the next generation of the National Science Education Standards that were written in 1996. They were pretty good. But these are much more specific, and these are measurable. They aren't measurable easily with a paper and pencil test. Some of them can be measured that way, but the way to really measure it is see if kids can do it. And that's the sort of thing that you can actually see in your classroom. And I'm talking about from kindergarten through 9th grade. Obviously, you're going to expect a much different level of sophistication as you go up the grades. But you can see whether or not your kids can do these things. So the important part now is to marry the two together, to marry the core ideas and the practices. And that's what we turn to next. So let's look at the next slide. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, performance expectations are the sentences that link the core ideas and practices. They are the heart of the standards. When people ask, well, what are the standards? They immediately turn to this box at the top of the page, the NGSS, that has several sentences. And those sentences are the performance expectations, because that's what says what students should know and be able to do. Now I'm going to show you some examples from kindergarten through grade 5. But keep in mind the method and approach works at all grade levels. So, and this is what the work really was on the writing team for the NGSS. So let's look at this practice. Ask questions and define problems. So for a kindergarten level, what this means is to ask questions based on observations to find out more. And in the case of engineering, it's about the designed world. And that's what we're about to do, is construct a performance expectation involving defining problems about the design world. Natural hazards. Now, that's another thing that, again, you'll find in the framework that we want kindergarten students to know about. Some kinds of severe weather are more likely than others in a given region. So weather scientists forecast severe weather so people can be prepared for them. And then there's one other core idea. Remember, engineering and technology is not just a practice, but a core idea too. And that's to define and delimit an engineering problem. So let's now look at the performance expectation that represents stitching these together. So here it is. Students should be able to ask questions to obtain information about the purpose of weather forecasting to prepare for and respond to severe weather. So imagine now a kindergartner and someone who predicts the weather. It might be either a meteorologist or a teacher who has done some background reading about this. And coaching the students about, well, what would we want to ask, and think first of all about what kind of severe weather you have in your particular area. If you live in the Midwest, you might want to be asking about tornadoes. If you live on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast, you might be wanting to ask about hurricanes. And if you live where I do in Portland, you want to be asked about being inundated with rain for 9 months of the year. So what kinds of questions would we be asking about so that we could learn more about this kind of weather before it happens so that we can figure out how to best prepare for it? Let's go on to the next example, which is a grade 1 example. Now let me say a little bit about the process of constructing these. Usually what we did is we looked first at the core idea and then asked ourselves, well, what practice would go well with this core idea where students could demonstrate their understanding? So in this case, it's inheritance of traits. So young animals are very much, but not exactly like their parents. Plants, animals, both are not precisely like their parents, but a lot like them. So this is the basic idea in part of the core idea of evolution. That's where we get to eventually, but we start out with the idea that we all look a little bit like our parents. The variation of traits is another idea. Individuals of the same kind of plant or animal are recognizable as similar, but can vary in many ways. That's kind of another way of putting variation of traits. So you've got the inheritance of traits and then the variation of them. Both kind of foundational ideas at the first grade level, leading eventually to an understanding of evolution. And then the practice that was chosen would be constructing explanations and designing solutions. So I think you can see where this is probably going to go. Probably going to go towards constructing an evidence-based account for a natural phenomenon. So let's see where that wound up as a performance expectation. Okay, here it is. First grade, make observations to construct an evidence-based account that young plants and animals are like but not exactly like the parents. This one seems like an obvious one. Well, let's have the kids make those observations, gather the evidence, and show their understanding. So, I'm taller than my father, but we both have the shiny forehead. I have a little more hair than he did at my age, but we could compare those. Or we could look at plants. I mean, I think kids would probably rather do that than looking at an old man. But that's the idea, that we want them to actually be gathering actual evidence, so this becomes more meaningful for them. Let's go on to the second grade. Okay, so starting with the core idea, this is about interdependent relationships in ecosystems. So plants depend on animals for pollination and to move their seeds around. So the first part is pollination, which is one idea. The other idea is that when seed dispersal, so the seeds of little birds would be picked up by an animal and carried somewhere else, or birds like the beautiful little red berries in our holly trees, and then they fly somewhere else and they leave them elsewhere with their waste and grows more holly trees, which is why we've been told to cut our holly trees so that we don't disperse another invasive species, which we're thinking about. Again, developing a possible solution. This is another core idea, that designs can be conveyed through sketches, drawings, or physical models. And those are useful in communicating ideas. Frankly, they're also useful in developing ideas, because as you draw something, it helps the idea crystallize. So these are two different core ideas that we want to capture in a single performance expectation, because if we want to keep things limited so that teachers aren't required to get their students to do too many different kinds of things and have the curriculum go out of control, we really want to start chunking things and reducing the number. So for this one, we picked the practice of developing and using models. Now to some, oops, okay, well it popped up. So let's see what it says. Develop a simple model that mimics the function of an animal in dispersing seeds or pollinating plants. This is one of the most popular elementary activities now. I see it done many times because kids have a lovely time doing it. They understand the role of bees, for example, in pollination. And they understand the relationship between the bee and the plant's reproduction. And it's a very creative activity to try different types of materials to see what will pollinate well. And again, it's another way of helping to understand the evolution, or the coevolution in this case, of plants and animals at grade 2. A word before we go on to the next one about why we select the different practices. I would call this an artful choice. There was no absolute requirement that we had to pick this practice or that practice. And I'll tell you a little later about some of the decision rules we used in making the choices. But there were other choices. The point is we made a choice. And by making a choice, it limits the number of performance expectations out there for teachers to teach to. And I'm thinking about that teacher back in Washington State that gave me that challenge. Just tell me what you want my kids to do. So let's move on to the 3rd grade example. And we'll go through these a little more quickly now, so there's some time for questions. But core idea here is evidence of common ancestry and diversity. So some kinds of plants and animals that once lived on Earth are no longer to be found. And the practice was analyzing and interpreting data in this case. So it's going a little further than the fact that there were dinosaurs and there aren't dinosaurs anymore. So let's look at the performance expectation of that one. To analyze and interpret data from fossils to provide evidence of the organisms and environments in which they lived long ago. So it's not only the fact that there were dinosaurs, but what else was around when the dinosaurs were around? What did the dinosaurs eat? What was their environment like? What ate them? So realizing that we can uncover that sort of information of something millions of years ago. So again, these are fairly deep ideas for young children that are certainly within their capabilities, and you get at them by combining the combining the core idea and the practice. Let's go on to the 4th grade. So this one's about natural resources. Energies and fuels that humans use are derived from natural sources, and their use affects the environment in multiple ways. Some are reusable, some are renewable, and some are not. So the practice we selected was obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. At the 4th grade level, that would be from books and other reliable media. So I'm thinking of the Internet, but not all Internet sites. And so students might begin to look more carefully at what sites are getting or what are the reasons for biases. And in this case in particular, regarding usable and non-usable fuels, there are different reasons that one source or another might have a bias. So this is an especially interesting area for students to be using. They're developing their skill about obtaining and evaluating and communicating information. Let's look at the performance expectation, which is to obtain and combine information. To obtain and combine, in this case, to describe that energy fuels are derived from natural resources and their uses affect the environment. So it's time for students to start learning about the fuels that power lights, that warm their houses, that heat their water, and so forth. and what the environmental impacts of those are. Not to as great a depth as we want at the middle school or high school level, but we're getting started. And let's look at the last one for 5th grade level. The core idea here is about the organization for matter and energy flowing in organisms. So plants acquire the material for growth chiefly from air and water. This is another area, actually, and there's a very common misconception. Kids have a hard time understanding that most of the material in a plant tissue actually comes from carbon dioxide in the air. Air, it seems, has no weight, so how could it possibly build the mass that we see in a tree? So this is a really challenging idea, and we want students to support an argument with evidence or data or a model. Let's see how that looks when we combine them. And that is to support an argument that plants get the materials they need for growth chiefly from air and water, not from soil. And there's a clarification there. We didn't show it here on the screen, but about this practice, or about this core idea that the primary ingredients in plant tissues actually come from carbon dioxide in the air. So what's the evidence for that? And there we're beginning to think about instruction. So yes, these performance expectations are what students should know at the end of instruction. But there are certainly clues about the kind of instruction we want, so kids end up there at the end of a unit. So let's go on to the next slide. And so here's a little bit about the decision rules that we used in connecting the core ideas. So first of all, we did not follow a formula. You don't say, well, okay, we used these practices before, this is the next one on the list, let's just put them together and move on. The goal, there are a number of goals. So one goal was to use all the different practices so students could learn them at each grade level. So in other words, for 5th graders, we don't want 5th graders to be all using the practice of investigating. It's a little like the kind of science that we've had before, when there was just always doing experiments and not arguing from evidence and not asking questions and defining problems to solve. So we want to have more of a mix so that students across the grades get to develop all 8 practices at increasing sophistication at each grade level. Another goal was to use most of the disciplinary core ideas, so the remaining set is manageable. I say most. All along the way, when we asked teachers to give us feedback, we were told too much, too much, too much. So we finally, that last change from the public release to the final release, we actually cut about 1/3 of the core ideas that were handed to us from the framework. And that involved discussion with the committee that put the framework together, that we were permitted to do that because, again, thinking of that group in New Jersey who could teach to mastery, but only if the amount of material was limited. So, and then the next bullet is when pairing a given practice with a given core idea. So we had to ask ourselves, how could we assess this, and how could we teach it? So before we finished the performance expectation, we had that conversation, and to realize that these are accessible and they are teachable. And keep in mind, half of the writers were teachers, and that means teachers with current teaching experience. And the rest of us, most of the rest of us, have been teachers. So I'm not a teacher now, except I am teaching at the graduate level, but I'm not a K-12 teacher now, but I have taught for a number of years at the high school and middle school and upper elementary levels. And those experiences stick with you, but having a teacher with a current teaching assignment is also very important to bounce ideas off of. And then finally, the performance expectations had to make sense. So a teacher could envision what it would look like for their students to do this. And again, some of them maybe still could use a little more sense making, but it was always hard to put together a core idea and a practice and make them make a sentence that made sense. We also had to combine cross-cutting concepts, but that's the topic of another webinar. So let's go on to the next slide. And And the question is, how can teachers use these performance expectations? And for the principals out there, how can your teachers use these performance expectations? Keep in mind that we wrote them not just for assessment developers and curriculum developers and teacher educators, but we wanted teachers to be able to read them too. And I would suggest that a teacher who's going to teach a unit on a given topic that you'll find in the next generation science centers ask themselves these questions. What experiences should my students have in order to be able to do this? That's kind of the fundamental question of how do I help my kids perform well when we get to the assessment. And I believe that these performance assessments are worth teaching to. So what curriculum materials do I know about that provide those experiences? So it takes so much time to develop curricula. You should not have to spend your summer doing curriculum development. Now, some teachers like to do that. And again, I would suggest starting with what's already out there. So again, instead of reinventing the wheel, find the best wheels you can and see how to improve them. What could my students do to demonstrate to me that they can meet these performance expectations? So what evidence am I going to look at? Not at the end, but during the course of the unit, so I can make corrections as needed. And then how can I construct a whole sequence of lessons so students can meet several of these performance expectations while engaged in activities that are meaningful to them? So Ala, do we have another slide? Okay. I think this is the last slide. So it asks the questions, are teachers limited to the performance expectations? And the answer is no. That sometimes students need to develop an idea in order to understand the performance expectation. Not everything is in there. They do need to develop all-day practices, that's for sure. But they can learn those practices in different contexts. In fact, they need to learn them in different contexts if they're going to become really useful and flexible. And they need to learn the disciplinary core ideas by engaging in them in a number of different ways. So in a given unit, you don't just use the practice connected to that core idea in the performance expectation. You use a number of different practices so they really become familiar with that core idea. It's only in the end that you want them to demonstrate their understanding with respect to that particular practice. And finally, the performance expectation is the bottom line, the outcome of a conceptually rich and engaging unit of study. You're not, I can't tell you how many people have said, does this mean I can't teach X anymore? No, not at all. If that X is really important to teach, then you should teach it. And if it's something you enjoy and you have passion about, by all means, that's what teachers should be doing, is communicating that passion to their students. So you aren't limited, but you do have, but the bottom line is you do have to teach all the performance expectations that are assigned to your grade level or your grade band, however you worked it out in your district about what happens in different courses at the middle and high school level. That's the bottom line, but it doesn't mean that's all there is. So I think we should stop right there because it's close to the end of our webinar, and I want to see if we have a question or two. So Ala, do we have a question for me to answer? Oh, and we'll leave those resources up for you.
We do. Samantha would like to know, for practice 5 and 6, she says, I'm confused about how simulations involve mathematics. It seems like the results are the results of an experiment.
Oh, good question. Well, simulations are actually built based on some mathematical formula. So the idea is that over time, students begin with simulations that, well, okay, there are a couple of ways. First of all, I'm picturing there's a really good series of simulations, science simulations. I'm thinking it's PHET. I might be wrong about that. But imagining one about a wave and for elementary level. And what you do is you use a slider and you change the wavelength and see how it relates to the frequency of the wave. So there's some numerical relationships there. There's an inverse relationship where the longer the wavelength, the slower the frequency, and vice versa. So there's some understanding of a mathematical relationship in a physical setting. Later on, at the high school level, on occasion, we'd like the students actually to use an equation to develop their own simulation. This is new, and it involves both mathematics and computational thinking, that students should be able to acquire the skill by the time they reach 12th grade. So that really means using the mathematics to do the science. And in the case of the tank we were talking about before, we're probably talking about probabilities. So what's the probability that the lionfish will eat the reef fish? What percentage of the reef fish will be gone after a certain period of time? What if you introduce the predator, and how will that relationship change over time? So there's actually a lot of mathematics involved, but it's a sort of mathematics that scientists use to not only gather and collect data, but to develop a mathematical model and test that model through simulations. Hope that answered your question. Do we have another question?
We do. Margaret would like to know, she says, it seems to me that the engineering, oops, I'm sorry, that just went away. It seems to me that the engineering perspective requires deeper thinking than science. Is that how you see it?
Oh, wonderful question. Yes, in the sense that it usually takes longer because there are more things to consider. So it's not only understanding a situation and being able to answer it, but going on to other types of questions of implementation. And also often there's a phase of testing, and then if we think of a way of improving it, of modifying it and optimizing it, and then going back and saying, did we really solve the problem? Are we really meeting the need that we thought we were meeting? Is there a better way to solve the problem? So I think it involves deeper thinking, and I think it involves more time, which means making decisions about what to include and what not. And I hope that we made things easier by reducing the amount of stuff so that there is more time to, it also means learning in greater depth. So yeah, deeper thinking, more time, greater depth. I would agree with that.
Great.
You have another question?
Yep. Valerie would like to know, as we know, developing solutions and testing them often takes additional time and materials, which often causes teachers not to want to engage in engineering-type projects. So
Yep.
her question is, have you seen any system that has successfully combined a science course with an engineering course, and if so, what does that look like?
Okay. Let's see. I'm not thinking of a particular district or school right now. I'm thinking of some curriculum materials that I know have been tested. Okay, well, I'll talk about the one that I do know about, and that's a course called Engineering the Future, which I developed with a group of folks in Massachusetts. And it's the science of energy. Now, energy is a difficult concept for kids, but because energy has so many different manifestations, it looks so different. Thermal energy looks so different from kinetic energy, which looks so different from light energy. So how do you teach energy, and how do you help kids develop a really robust idea of energy and some rules, some guidelines about energy? So our course which is designed for high school freshmen to get them interested in the possibility of engineering as a career, and as an introduction to physics. So when they get to physics, they'll at least have this part of energy, ideas about energy worked out fairly well. So I began slowly with mainly about what is engineering and how you meet people's needs and solve problems. And then we moved into thermal energy first with regard to designing houses, because houses meet a particular need. And we wanted to design houses that would have a low carbon footprint and so forth, so you want good insulation. So we introduced the idea that when you have a thermal barrier like a wall, that the greater difference in temperature, the faster will be the transfer of thermal energy. So a very cold climate, it's going to get cold inside the house quickly unless you keep heating the house rapidly, or unless you have a really good insulator. So the second idea is that the transfer of energy is inversely proportional to the resistance, in this case an insulator. And then thirdly, once the energy on two sides of the barrier is equal, there will be no more transfer. We applied that idea to electricity later on. And we applied that same idea to engines, where a change in temperature leads to a change in pressure, which leads to motion. So we really used very different engineering settings to communicate this basic set of ideas about energy, which happened to be a very important part of the Massachusetts framework, and is also an important part now of the Next Generation Science Standards. So what it looked like was actually an engineering class where kids were talking a lot about the science to understand different settings and different situations, and really understanding what an engine actually does and how an engine depends on these energy transformations. What it looked like was doing a lot of things with materials, with measurements, temperature measurements, actually building small motors or small engines rather, and electrical connections and frequent challenges trying to get things to work, and then introducing the science as it's needed to solve the engineering tasks. Now, in one case, we had a science teacher and a technology teacher working together, but that's not essential. It just makes things easier. It looks like we're about out of time, Ala, so I'm going to say thank you to all of our participants today, and look forward to seeing you next time, where we talk about the missing core idea in the Next Generation Science Standards.
Yes, thank you, Cary, very much. For those of you who still have outstanding questions, we will follow up with you via email. And before you leave us, there will be a survey right after this webinar. We would really appreciate it if you would take the survey, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Take care.